There is a moment, and if you have ever loved someone completely, you know this moment, where you realize that doing the right thing will cost you everything. Not your money, not your reputation, your son. In the spring of 2019, a 68-year-old man named Robert Ellison Hargrove walked into a federal courtroom in downtown Chicago. He was not the defendant. He was not a lawyer. He was not a spectator. He was the prosecution's key witness. And the man he was about to testify against, the man whose freedom rested entirely on what Robert said next, was sitting 15 feet away, his son. Robert Hargrove sat in that chair for 4 hours. He answered every question. He told the truth, every single word of it. Before we get to that courtroom, before we get to the moment that ended everything, there are 3 questions you need to sit with. The first question: how does a father discover that his son, the child he raised, the man he was prouder of than anything he had ever built with his own hands, has been stealing from people? Not corporations, not banks, people. Retirees, widows, teachers who worked 30 years to save $200,000. Families who trusted a name, the Hargrove name, because Robert himself had told them to. The second question: how long can a man look the other way? Because Robert Hargrove did not go straight to the FBI, not immediately. What he did first, and what it cost him, is something most of us will never have to decide. The third question: when Robert finally sat in that witness stand, when he looked at the federal prosecutor and said, "Yes, I will tell you everything," was that justice? Or was it something far more complicated? Stay with me, because by the end of this, I think you'll understand something about loyalty and conscience that most people spend their entire lives running from. Robert Ellison Hargrove was born in 1951 in Rockford, Illinois, the son of a machinist and a schoolteacher. He grew up in a house where the rules were simple. You work hard, you pay your debts, you keep your word. Those weren't values that were discussed at the dinner table. They were assumed the way gravity is assumed. You didn't question them. You just lived inside them. Robert became a civil engineer, spent 32 years with the same infrastructure firm, designing bridges and drainage systems across the Midwest. He was the kind of man who showed up early and left late, who remembered the names of his colleagues' children, who, when the firm threw him a retirement party in 2013, received a standing ovation that lasted nearly 3 minutes. Not because he was extraordinary, because he was reliable. In a world full of people who say one thing and do another, Robert Hargrove always did what he said he would do. He married Margaret Elliott in 1978. Margaret was a pediatric nurse, sharp, funny, occasionally impatient with Robert's stubbornness, but deeply in love with the man underneath it. They had 2 children, a daughter, Christine, and a son born in 1982, Daniel. From the very beginning, Daniel Hargrove was the kind of child that made strangers stop and comment. Not just because he was handsome, though he was, but because he had a quality that is almost impossible to teach. He made people feel seen. He remembered what you told him. He asked follow-up questions. He had a way of tilting his head and listening, really listening, that made whoever he was talking to feel like the most important person in the room. Robert used to say that Daniel could sell a glass of water to a drowning man and make the drowning man feel grateful for the transaction. He said it with pride. Daniel graduated from the University of Illinois with a degree in finance in 2004, magna cum laude. Within 3 years, he had his Series 65 license, his own registered investment advisory practice, and a client list that was growing faster than anyone in his peer group could explain. He called his firm Hargrove Capital Partners. He used his father's name. Robert was honored. By 2010, Hargrove Capital Partners had offices in the Gold Coast neighborhood of Chicago, mahogany desks, framed commendations on the wall, a receptionist who greeted clients by name. Daniel drove a black BMW, wore suits that cost more than Robert made in a month at 25. And Robert, proud, trusting, completely devoted Robert, had personally referred 11 of his friends, neighbors, and former colleagues to his son's firm. Put your money with Daniel, he'd tell them at church, at the hardware store, over backyard fences. He'll take care of you. He's a Hargrove. Margaret Hargrove passed away in January 2016, pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. It was the kind of loss that doesn't just take a person, it reshuffles the entire architecture of who you are without them. Robert went quiet for a long time after Margaret died, but Daniel was there every weekend, calling every evening, sitting with his father in silence when silence was all that was available. In those months, Robert fell in love with his son all over again. He trusted Daniel with everything. Everything. It was an ordinary Tuesday in March 2018 when Robert Hargrove's world began to come apart. Daniel had leased new office space, bigger, he said, to accommodate the firm's growth, and he'd asked Robert to help him move some archived files from the old offices before the lease expired. Robert had nothing else to do that day. He was retired, still grieving, happy to feel useful. He showed up at 7 a.m. with coffee and a pair of work gloves. Daniel was running late, so Robert started packing boxes on his own. He was methodical about it, the way engineers are methodical about everything. Label the box, document the contents, stack in order. He was on his third cabinet when he found a folder that didn't match the others. It wasn't labeled the way Daniel's other files were labeled. No client name, no account number. Just a handwritten word on the tab in Daniel's handwriting, reconciliation. Robert almost put it in the box without opening it. Almost. What was inside that folder were two sets of financial statements. One set, the ones that went to clients, showed healthy, growing portfolios, consistent returns. Exactly what clients like Robert's church friends and former colleagues had been told to expect. The other set, the internal statements, told a completely different story. The accounts were nearly empty. Not every account, but enough. Enough that the math was unmistakable. Robert stood in that empty office for a very long time. He told himself there was an explanation. He told himself there had to be. He put the folder back exactly where he found it. He finished packing all the boxes. He drove home. And he didn't say a word. This is the part of the story that is hardest to judge and hardest to understand unless you have loved someone the way Robert loved Daniel. Because what Robert did next wasn't cowardice, and it wasn't complicity. It was something more complicated than either of those words. It was a father trying, with everything he had, to find a version of reality where his son was not a criminal. For 6 weeks, Robert lived inside that private horror. He started pulling threads, quietly, carefully, the way an engineer approaches a structural problem, not with panic, but with method. He called an old college friend who worked in financial compliance, asked hypothetical questions about how investment accounts worked, asked what certain irregularities might mean. He Googled terms he had never needed to know before. Ponzi scheme, client fund segregation, securities fraud. Each answer made the picture sharper and sharper and sharper. $47 million. That was the number Robert eventually pieced together. $47 million raised from approximately 230 clients over 9 years. Not invested, spent. Daniel's lifestyle, the office, the BMW, a lake house in Michigan. A personal account in the Cayman Islands that Robert had not known existed. And among those 230 clients, 11 people that Robert Ellison Hargrove had personally vouched for. One of them was a 72-year-old widow named Helen Marsh. Robert had known Helen for 20 years. She had been Margaret's closest friend. She had stood at Margaret's graveside and held Robert's hand. Helen had invested her entire retirement savings, $380,000, with Hargrove Capital Partners, on the advice of Robert Hargrove. On the 43rd day after finding the folder, Robert called Daniel. He didn't accuse, he didn't shout. He asked Daniel to come over for dinner. And when Daniel arrived, relaxed, charming, carrying a bottle of wine, Robert placed the folder on the kitchen table between them. Neither man spoke for nearly a full minute. Then Daniel said something that Robert would repeat word for word in the federal courtroom 14 months later. He said, "Dad, I was going to fix it. I just needed more time." Robert told Daniel he had 1 week. 1 week to go to the authorities himself, to walk into the FBI field office on Roosevelt Road in Chicago and turn himself in. Robert told his son that if he didn't, Robert would make the call. 1 week passed. Daniel did not go to the FBI. Instead, he hired a lawyer. And he called his father and told him that if Robert went to the authorities, it would destroy the family. It would destroy Christine's marriage. Her husband worked in finance, and the association alone could cost him his career. It would put Daniel in federal prison for 20 years. It would be Robert's fault, all of it. Robert sat with that for 3 more days. And then on a gray Thursday morning in September 2018, he called the FBI. The FBI's investigation of Hargrove Capital Partners had actually already begun, quietly, 6 months earlier, after a retired school teacher named Donna Pierce filed a complaint with the SEC after noticing irregularities in her quarterly statements. Robert didn't know this when he called. When the agents told him, when they told him the investigation was already underway, that they already had subpoenas, that Daniel's time was already running out, Robert didn't feel relief. He felt the floor disappear beneath him, because what the agents then told him was the part no one had warned him about. They needed him, not just as a background source, not just as a cooperating witness who provided documents and walked away. They needed Robert Ellison Hargrove to take the stand, in open court, under oath, and testify against his son. The assistant U.S. attorney assigned to the case, a woman named Claire Donovan, told Robert directly. Without his testimony, the case against Daniel was strong but not airtight. Daniel's legal team was already constructing a narrative in which the accounting irregularities were the result of negligence, not fraud. Without someone who could testify to the intent, without someone Daniel had directly told, I was going to fix it. I just needed more time. The defense had a viable argument. Robert was the only person who had heard those words. He asked for 48 hours. Claire Donovan gave him the weekend. What happened in those 48 hours, the internal reckoning that Robert Hargrove went through, is not something any of us can fully reconstruct, but we know some of what he did. He drove to Helen Marsh's house and sat with her for 2 hours. He didn't tell her why he was there. He just sat with her. He visited Margaret's grave. He called Christine and told her everything. She went silent for a long time, and then she said, "Dad, do what's right. Mom would have told you the same thing." On Monday morning, Robert called Claire Donovan. He said yes. Daniel Hargrove was arrested in November 2018. He pleaded not guilty. His legal team was aggressive, expensive, and methodical. They portrayed Daniel as a well-meaning entrepreneur whose business model had collapsed during a difficult period in the markets, a man who had made poor decisions but had never intended to defraud anyone. It was a compelling story. It was also, as Robert knew better than anyone, a lie. The trial of Daniel Matthew Hargrove began on April 14, 2019. It lasted 11 days. Robert sat in that courtroom for every single one of them, not at the defense table, not at the prosecution table, but in the gallery, in the third row, watching his son perform, because that was the word for it. Daniel was composed, articulate. He looked at the jury when he spoke. He thanked his lawyers quietly. He dressed conservatively, no BMW energy, no Gold Coast energy. He looked, by design, like a man who had made mistakes and was sorry for them. On the 8th day of trial, Robert Hargrove was called to the witness stand. He walked through the courtroom alone. He did not look at Daniel. He sat down. He adjusted the microphone. He looked at Claire Donovan. And for the next 4 hours, Robert Ellison Hargrove told the truth. He described finding the folder. He described the kitchen table conversation. He repeated Daniel's words, "I was going to fix it. I just needed more time," into a microphone that carried them to 12 jurors, to a federal judge, to 230 defrauded clients who were watching from the gallery. He described the 11 people he had personally referred to his son. He described Helen Marsh. At one point, Daniel's defense attorney asked Robert, "Mr. Hargrove, do you love your son?" Robert paused, a long pause, and then he said, "Yes, I do. That's why I'm here." The jury deliberated for 7 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on all 14 counts. Daniel Matthew Hargrove was sentenced to 19 years in federal prison. He has never spoken to his father since the day of the verdict. Here is what the verdict did not fix. Helen Marsh recovered 41 cents on every dollar she had invested with Hargrove Capital Partners. At 73 years old, she returned to part-time work, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Of the 230 clients defrauded by Hargrove Capital Partners, fewer than half received meaningful restitution. The lake house was sold. The Cayman account was seized. It wasn't enough. Christine Hargrove's husband did lose clients, not his career, but enough to matter. Their marriage survived, but it was changed. These things always change what they touch. And Robert? Robert Ellison Hargrove is 73 years old now. He still lives in the same house he shared with Margaret for 38 years. He still attends the same church where he once stood at the back and proudly pointed out his son to anyone who would listen. He has visited Daniel once in prison. Daniel refused to come to the visiting room. He has never stopped writing him letters. None have been answered. I want to ask you something before we close. Because this story is not really about fraud. It was never really about money or courts or verdicts. It is about the moment, the specific, terrible, clarifying moment, when loyalty and conscience stop pointing in the same direction. Most of us will never face it at the scale Robert Hargrove faced it. But most of us will face a version of it. A friend who is doing something wrong. A partner, a colleague, a child, someone we love, really love, who is causing real harm to real people. And the question that Robert's story leaves us with isn't whether he made the right choice. I think he did. The question is, what does it cost? Robert Hargrove did what his father taught him to do. He worked hard, he paid his debts, he kept his word. Even when keeping his word meant walking into a federal courtroom and watching the bailiff lead his son away in handcuffs. Even when it meant coming home to a house that had never felt more empty. Even when it meant writing letters that never came back. That is what conscience costs, and that is why so few people are willing to pay it. Before you go, I want to know what you think. If you were Robert Hargrove, if it was someone you loved, could you have made that call? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story reached something in you, if it made you think about loyalty or conscience, or the people you love and what you would do for them, then you already understand what this channel is about. Hit subscribe. Because next time, we're going somewhere even darker. A woman who kept a secret for 23 years that was not hers to keep. The person it belonged to never knew. And the day they found out changed everything about everything. You will not see the ending coming. We promise you that. I'll see you there, where every story rewires your mind.